Have you ever known someone that you would say was an eternal optimist? You know, these are the people who always see things in a positive light no matter what. In December of 1914, a 67-year-old man watched as his life's work was being burned to the ground. Adding insult to injury, his property was only insured for $238,000, far less than the $2 million worth of damage that was being done. His 24-year-old son, Charles, standing beside him, would later say, "My heart ached for him. He was 67, no longer a young man, and everything was going up in flames." Charles was then surprised by his dad's request. He said, "Find your mother and bring her here. She will never see anything like this as long as she lives." The next morning this man gathered his employees at the charred ruins and said, "There is great value in disaster. All of our mistakes are burned up. Thank God that we can start anew." 3 weeks later, Thomas Edison delivered his first phonograph. We all have disasters and disappointments to face in this life. We all face times of discouragement. But in those times of despair, we have a choice to make. We can crumble under the weight of self-pity and wonder, "Why me?" Or we can allow it to be a time of renewal and an opportunity to learn. That's the beauty of choice God has given each of us. Some have even called it a responsibility, or as Stephen Covey has said, our ability to respond to what happens. In the Bible, we have many examples of people's responses to things that happen to them. Joseph in Genesis is sold to slave traders, bought as a servant, thrown into prison, and ultimately raised to a high governmental position. His response was to remain faithful to God, and later to be able to look back and see that the things that happened were the hand of God working through him to save his family. The prophet Jeremiah was ridiculed and thrown into a mud pit. He got to the point in Jeremiah chapter 20 that he was ready to quit. However, listen to how he responded to that in Jeremiah chapter 20, beginning in verse 9. "But if I say I will not remember him or speak any more in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it. For I have heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. Denounce him. Yes, let us denounce him. All my trusted friends, watching for my fall, say, perhaps he will be deceived so that we may prevail against him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me like a dread champion. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will be utterly ashamed because they have failed, with an everlasting disgrace that will not be forgotten." Jeremiah chose to stand with God. Daniel, a young captive taken to a foreign land, was made to learn a new language, take on a new name, and be educated in a culture with multiple gods. In that setting, he chose to hold to his faith and not defile himself. That was at the beginning of what is known as the Babylonian captivity of Israel. After that captivity ended, some of the Jews returned to Jerusalem to rebuild, but things did not go well. Finally, God brought Nehemiah to Jerusalem with the task of rebuilding the walls and helping the people regroup. Those days described in the book of Nehemiah portray difficult times and a spirit of discouragement among the people. Yet the task was completed. How was Nehemiah able to accomplish this? Perhaps what he did might help us as we struggle with some of our own disappointments. First, Nehemiah refused to listen to the naysayers, those folks who always seem to have reasons we cannot do something. In Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, Tobiah and Sanballat, two non-Jewish inhabitants of the land, made fun of the attempts to rebuild and, according to verse 5, demoralized the builders. Nehemiah refused to listen to them. We can overcome discouragement if we will refuse to listen to the naysayers in our lives, and there are plenty of them. Don't allow yourself to be influenced by their negativity. Now you may be thinking, well, sure, it's a nice thing to say you won't be affected by negative comments or actions, but it's a lot easier said than done. And you're absolutely right. It's not an easy task to let those hurtful comments go in one ear and out the other. But notice how Nehemiah handles it. In verses 4 through 5 of Nehemiah chapter 4, Nehemiah turns to prayer and puts it into God's hands. If you read through the book of Nehemiah, you will often find him taking his problems and struggles to God. Secondly, do something. Nehemiah chapter 4 verse 6 says, "So we built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." If we allow ourselves enough time to sit around and think about all the horrible things in this world, or enough time to think about all the discouraging people in our lives, then we will never be able to overcome discouragement. But if we can learn the lesson of Nehemiah and have a mind to work, then we will be too busy to worry about all of the negative possibilities that are out there. We won't have time to be concerned over what might go wrong or what could be a discouragement. Thirdly, remember who is on your side. When their words of discouragement failed to stop the building, Tobiah and Sanballat plotted to physically attack the Jews. Hearing of this, Nehemiah stationed people to watch while others worked. More importantly, he encouraged them in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 14 by saying, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome." In our own times of discouragement, it would do us a great deal of good to remember the Lord. Remember who it is that's on your side. Remember who it is that has helped you through difficult times in the past. Remember who it is that parted the Red Sea, that took Elijah up in a chariot of fire, that made the blind to see and the deaf to hear. If our God can do these amazing things, then surely He can help us through our discouraging times. James J. Colquitt was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world in 1892. Someone once asked him, what was the most important thing a man must do to become a champion? He replied, "Fight one more round." The Duke of Wellington said that the British soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo were not any braver than Napoleon's soldiers, but they were brave for 5 minutes longer. When faced with discouragement, remember to fight just one more round, and be brave for 5 more minutes. That will often be the difference between victory and defeat. So let us not forget how we can overcome discouragement. We can overcome discouragement by refusing to listen to the naysayers, by having a mind to work, and keeping ourselves busy. We can overcome discouragement by remembering that God Almighty is on our side. And may He comfort, strengthen, and bless you this week.